Welcome to our second session of the Understanding and Automating Counterspeech workshop. For those who weren't in the previous session, this event is being hosted by the Giving Voice to Digital Democracies project at the University of Cambridge. And in this session, we're focusing particularly on automated and computational approaches to countering hate speech online. So we have, as previously mentioned, there are closed captions available if you would like to use them. These are provided by Zoom, and so CRASSH has no accountability for the accuracy. The sessions are being recorded and will be made available on the CRASSH website shortly after the event. For asking questions, please feel free to write them in the text chat box as we progress. But if you would like to also ask a question directly, please use the raise your hand function and you can unmute when when you're invited to do so. If you don't want to be included in the videos, please keep your camera off and your mics, and we ask everyone to keep the mics muted throughout the talks. We're keen to have a lot of discussion in these sessions. There will be ample opportunity for Q&As at the end. So yeah, we're looking forward to that discussion. And joining us today, we have two excellent speakers. We've got Bertie Vidgen, who is a research fellow in online harms within the public policy program at the Alan Turing Institute. And in his work, he primarily uses computational social science methods, including machine learning and natural language processing and statistical modeling. His research focuses on detecting, analyzing and countering hate speech in the context of news, social media, extremism and misinformation. His recent publications have addressed multimodal dimensions of hate speech, including the use of emojis and memes in hate speech and hateful content. And he has also worked on evaluation methods for automatic detection systems and examining racial bias in automated hate detection and issues associated with the classification of different forms of hate. Our other speaker today that we're also joined by is Punyajoy Saha, who is a PhD student at the Synergy, I'm guessing it's pronounced lab, which is in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, West Bengal. And he also works in the areas of social computing and natural language processing, and has worked on a number of studies relating to offensive language and hate speech across a range of social media platforms. And again, he's looked at hate speech detection using techniques such as knowledge graphs and deep learning methods and temporal studies of hate speech on social media. He's also been involved in the creation of counter-speech data sets, complete with analysis of the linguistic features associated with more successful strategies, and worked on a fear speech project, so looking at messaging that works to instill fear associated with particular identity groups in the context of an Indian WhatsApp groups. So welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to hearing in more detail about this work and your thoughts on this area. And I think it should be a really nice complementary session to the first session, where we had a kind of range of different perspectives on the topic. So it'll be interesting to hear the kind of computational approaches that are working here today. So I thought to start off with, following on from the first session, could you similarly speak a little on just what you understand to be counter-speech and how your disciplinary positioning and the work that you do influences that understanding. So Bertie, are you happy to start?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So happy to be here. So I guess counter-speech is sort of content or activity that challenges abusive, hateful interactions online. And most of my work has been sort of at the intersection of machine learning and AI research and also social science. So I guess I try to have some kind of taxonomy or framework to then dig a little bit deeper into the different types of counter-speech and how we might be able to model that computationally.
Okay, that's great. Punyajoy?
Yeah, so I guess I was present in the previous session also, so taking some points from there also. So what I think counter speech is a way to respond in a way that it actually de-escalates the conversation and also aims to potentially influence the perpetrators, that those are doing these hateful comments, or at least try to influence the bystanders so that they can be encouraged to act in case of such comments. So more or less this is my speech, and probably I'm only like more or less working in this NLP domain along with the social science part. So most of my research is concerned with trying to understand how NLP can be used to do such counter speech or generate such counter speech, and apart from detecting speeches.
Okay, that's great. So I think that gives us a nice foundational touch point to start from. And yeah, shall I hand over to you now, Bertie, and you can start with your presentation. Then we'll have Punyajoy's presentation, and then we'll join for some questions together afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. No, happy to get started. So yeah, really glad to be here. My name is Bertie Vidgen, research fellow in online harms at the Turing. Well, I lead most of our work around what is now often called online safety, so hate speech, harassment, bullying, misinformation, extremism, and so on. I'm going to talk today about counter speech and AI. Is it an opportunity or a distraction? And I'll quickly introduce the Turing before I get going. So the Alan Turing Institute is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI. Our mission is to make great leaps in data science and artificial intelligence research in order to change the world for the better. So we were founded in 2016 with 5 different universities: Edinburgh, Oxford, Cambridge, UCL and Warwick, and also some funding from EPSRC and commercial partners. And then since then, we've expanded quite a lot. So I think now there's 13 universities in the network with plans to expand further. I sit in the public policy program, where we work with policymakers, regulators, civil society, security services to see how data science and AI can improve the work that they're doing and ultimately help us to solve complex problems and improve the provision of public services. Specifically within that, I lead our work around online safety and what's now called the online safety team. So we have 3 main work streams. One is looking at data-centric AI. So how can we build better AI systems, data sets, evaluation processes? And I think, even though there's lots of debate over how AI can help to tackle online harms and hazardous forms of content, in reality, it's going to be used and it is being used. And the future of solving online safety will reside heavily on AI. So the question is, well, how can we build the right AI and solve the right problems and also make sure that we use it responsibly and appropriately? The second area is an online harms observatory, which we're doing with UK government, so Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, really trying to provide real-time insight into the scope, dynamics, nature, prevalence of hate speech, misinformation, abuse, extremism, and so on. So that's been a really exciting piece that should be coming out. I think first version coming out sort of towards the end of this year, then more development over the next 2 years. So if that's of interest to anyone, please do let me know. We're always looking for more people to work with on the observatory. And then finally, policy making for online safety. So one of the big challenges in the space is that there's loads of awesome research, but it often does sort of just get published and thrown over the wall and forgotten about and not necessarily put into the hands of the people who need it and who want to read it and who it could actually help to inform their work, so practitioners. So we try to bridge that gap as much as we can. But enough of that, let me start talking about online hate and counter speech. So this is really the context in which I've mostly looked at counter speech. Counter is speech which counters, challenges, undermines, tackles hateful content and activity online. There are obviously other forms of counter speech too. So we have looked at counter speech that challenges other forms of abuse and other disrespectful, undesirable, toxic interactions online. But most of our work has focused on hate speech. Now, just in the interest of time, so there's a lot to get through, I decided not to do a whole load of introduction to hate speech and then counter speech and blah, 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 because I'm sure that lots of people here are familiar with the broad brushstrokes. You might have heard a lot of it this morning, and I didn't want to repeat all of that. So basically, hate speech is a problem. Exactly how it's a problem and how much you think we should do to tackle it and what ways it's a problem is all up for debate. But there is a very clear body of research that shows that online hate can inflict harm on people who are targeted or exposed to it. And this can have a really serious impact on their well-being, their communities, the constructiveness and usability and accessibility of online spaces. And ultimately, it can reflect on societal values. So hate speech is a problem. However, whenever we tackle hate speech, we have to think about the other social challenges. And the big one, of course, is the implication for freedom of speech. If we start taking down lots of hate speech, we are going to start constraining what people can do. Also, every hate speech moderation system that we have will be imperfect, which means that we will start picking up speech that isn't hateful and is being flagged for moderation or for takedown anyway. So we have to be really careful whenever we start trying to tackle hate speech that we're not going to cause other problems too. Again, sort of an unsolved problem, really. No one exactly knows where to draw the line or exactly how to balance these two things. We just know that we have to be somewhat attuned to it. So how can we tackle online hate? Well, the simplest way that we've seen is with content moderation, or at least the most widespread, widely used way is just to moderate the content. And we did a report for Ofcom last year, or the end of last year, around the AVMSD, which is new European-wide legislation to try and tackle hate speech and all sorts of issues relating to children and extremism in video sharing platforms, which is pretty much nearly all platforms that you can think of if they have a video sharing functionality. And so we started to look at the different ways that you can tackle online hate through using content moderation. And this broadly captures the kind of process that we see most platforms using. So users can report content for being hateful, and AI is filtering content. There's then either automated decisions and human review, and then some kind of intervention gets applied to the content. And maybe at the end, step 4, users can contest the decision if they think it's wrong. Not every platform lets the users do that, with varying degrees of success and information. So this is the kind of standard way that hate is tackled, is to have moderation systems. And of course, the big question is, how do you get your systems to be any good? It's incredibly tricky. And I'm sure lots of people here have seen the Wall Street Journal's Facebook files that came out very recently and certainly revealed a whole host of challenges and very questionable practices internally at the company. But this remains the most widely used approach. And I think it's important to add that we often talk about bans. When we talk about content moderation, we talk about banning content and banning hate speech. Turns out the platforms don't really want to do that because their business models are based around having lots of users, having lots of people creating content that you want to engage with. So banning users is not a great idea. A, you lose that user, like that user is now gone and it might not rejoin your service. And then B, you might also be getting rid of the content which inspires the most engagement and the most interaction, which of course, as a platform that's based around content and interaction, you want to encourage. So actually platforms are doing lots of other things. They're applying all these different constraints. And again, we did this for the Ofcom report, but we've since then identified far more. But it could be down to constraining how often something's shared, making it unsearchable, downvoting it, stopping paid promotion, requiring consent, adding warnings, all these different things that can be done. And by and large, these are done top down from the platform saying, right, this is how we're going to solve this. Here are our terms of service and our global enforcement of those terms of service. But there's another approach to doing it. And I think the other big countervailing view to this is that rather than trying to just ban, take down, make it harder to find, all these things which are ultimately about sort of adding more constraints or more frictions, that it's harder to engage with, search, view, find content. The alternative is that you just try to drown it out. Like the answer to banned speech is more good speech. And this has become really like quite a popular way of trying to solve this problem. And that makes sense, right? There's some really clear, there's a very nice message to having counter speech rather than banning stuff. But there are a few challenges, and we've identified a few in our research. I'm sure there's others. So the evidence on how well counter speech works is really limited. There are not that many longitudinal, systematic, quantitative studies that show, look, this really works. This is like the silver bullet that we've been waiting for. Second thing is that counter speech is really time intensive to produce. It's not trivial if you want to make good counter speech. It is quite a commitment. Third thing is that it requires expertise. It's difficult to produce, even if you have the time. You might still do a bad job if you haven't, engaged with the right communities and understood the problem. And then also there are undesirable consequences. So badly formulated counter speech could actually motivate more hate, and there has been a little bit of work that shows that. And then very simplistic or generic counter speech will just have very limited impact. It probably won't motivate hate, but it's probably not going to do much either. So can AI help with this problem? This is where the motivation for using AI comes in. And the reason why we use AI for nearly all social problems, to be honest, in a way, is scale. It's just that the sheer amount of hate speech and counter speech that we're talking about is way more than any human can produce. So we can use AI to scale the approach that we have. I thought it'd be helpful if I just very quickly give you a sense of how we can use AI to do this, and then I'll summarize by showing you what it is that we're doing with AI. So the first thing, if we want to use AI to generate counter speech, and this is generally what we're seeing AI being used for the most in the computational literature, is I want to train an AI system that will do this hard, labor-intensive, expertise-requiring, complex thing of generating counter speech and also generating good counter speech. So not just simplistic, generic statements which feel very disconnected to the hate speech which they're countering, but really context-specific, well-defined statements. The first thing we need to do is define what we want generated. Okay, in this case, counter speech. The next thing is that we need to start collecting and labeling a good data set. If we have a good data set, then we have a good chance of training a model to generate good counter speech. If we don't have a clear sense of what good looks like, then we're not going to go very far, I'm afraid. Third thing is that we need to train a model. So there's lots of new approaches out there. There's lots of what are often called large language models that we can start to deploy. And loads of huge advances across all of AI and NLP that we can start to leverage for what is actually a very specific task. So a lot of the big advances that we've seen recently have come from much wider advances in how we use computation. And then finally, we need to evaluate the system. We need to have a sense of, well, is this counter speech that we're generating any good? And that is incredibly tricky. Evaluating counter speech generated by an AI is really an unsolved problem, I would say at this point. And I thought it might help as well just to give you a sense of what we actually mean when we say AI generated counter speech, because it really does vary hugely. And this is a paper not by me or any of my colleagues, but by a group over in Italy. And this gives you an example of the kind of thing that we're talking about. So we have a prompt. In this case, Muslims are invading our country, which is their hateful statement. And then the counter speech, which has been generated by GPT-2, which says actually there were 17 million Muslims in the UK in 2016. So if you exclude London, that's actually increasing by 2%, which doesn't seem very significant. The first thing you might notice is that this doesn't seem quite right. So they say that it's fluent and credible. This is actually it's not quite right. And this is the challenge with AI generated counter speech. It's often just not quite right. And this kind of leads me to my next question of, well, why is AI not better? So we have this, we have this very clearly established problem, hate speech. Counter speech is a great solution to that problem. It has problems of its own. It's not very scalable. It's hard to produce. AI could then be the solution to that problem by giving us the scalability. But AI seems to not be doing as well as we want it to. And the first reason why AI is not very good at generating counter speech is just that it's not that great at complex tasks, that we're often pushing up against the limits of computation and model complexity. And this is from a US TV show, very much worth watching, about Silicon Valley startups. And it's actually surprising just how even relatively simple tasks AI struggles with, and counter speech is not a simple task by any means. Second thing is that lots of the big, large language models that we're relying on, and we've been using BART a lot in our research, they're trained on sanitized data. So these big, large language models that we then fine tune and deploy, they've only seen very clean, sanitized data. That means that they're not really used to what does hate speech, what does toxic language, what does messy social media data look like. Now that's a huge problem, because then when we ask them to do these tasks, they just have lots of challenges, and it's much more difficult. So we've been looking into, like, how can we train our own models, or how can we sort of continue the training of existing models to produce our own models that might be able to address this. And then third reason I have is that there's just not enough research. This is obviously completely biased insight and not even slightly objective. But if you search for hate speech in AI, you get 15,000 results in Google Scholar. If you search for counter speech in AI, you get 450 results. It's just a much smaller field, and there's just been much less work going into this over the last few years. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what we're working on at the Turing, and we've got lots of new projects to try and expand our interest into doing more on counter speech. And so we're trying to build an automated way of generating principled and context-specific counter speech using adversarial machine learning techniques. And I can just very quickly break that down a little bit. So when we say principled, we've been using Graham's framework of disagreement, and this idea that there are different ways to engage with someone and to challenge their position. And this can go from name calling all the way up to refuting the central point, with different degrees of sort of complexity and maybe sophistication is not quite the right word, but certainly looking at more reasoned, logical challenges. The further up the pyramid we go, and at the bottom, it's really just name calling, ad hominem attacks. Obviously, our goal is to try and train AI that will generate things towards the top of the pyramid rather than towards the bottom. The second thing is that we use an adversarial approach. So really happy to talk to anyone about this, but one of the best ways of training machine learning is to challenge your machine learning model as much as possible. So try and show it stuff that it will fail on, try to trick it, try to exploit it and push all of its weaknesses, and really then move iteratively to improve model performance. And that's something that we've been doing a lot of with hate speech detection, and we think will work well with counter speech generation too. Finally, is that we do have this generative approach. So we're working with some colleagues at UCL who have done a lot of work around creating really effective generative models. Not my primary research area, but one that I've become really interested in over the last few months. So I'll pause it there. Thank you for listening. I hope that was interesting. I hope that sparked a few things that we can talk about later on in the session. And I will hand back to Shauna.
Thanks, Bertie. That's great. So I think we'll move straight on to Punyajoy's talk now, and then hopefully, if any other speakers are here, they can all join as well in the discussion afterwards. But I'll hand over to you now. Punyajoy.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully you can see my screen. So my talk will be more or less in line of what Bertie did, but I will like to explain what we are doing also in this space. So first, let's start from a bit background of what is done after detecting hate speech. As we all know, and also Bertie explained it in set. These generally the current way of dealing with hate speech is like deletion of posts and suspension of user accounts. And as you can expect, this has some potential challenges. So I'm not saying that these are generally bad to do sometimes, but they have some challenges. So first one is like if we are deleting the post, we are essentially violating freedom of speech principle. And this can be problematic if, for example, if the post banned or like suspended was not actually hate speech and was a mistake. So in those cases, it's very essential to understand this freedom of speech principle. A second is suspension of user accounts. While this may look a bit better option, like we are suspending a user account who has been repeatedly hateful or something, this can also go bad because user can go to other platforms. And in a recent study, as this is again not our study, but to just refer, that they're actually turning more toxic when they move to other platforms like Gap. So this can also have negative. And secondly, they can form newer accounts in the same platform. So in this case, you can see that this is from Twitter. So the more hateful users are actually creating their accounts during the closer stages of this timeline, hence suggesting that they are more or less suspended and then they are creating the account. So what is the alternative? So as discussed or as a part of this conference workshop as well. So one of the alternatives is this counter speech. So what I explained earlier also, as counter speech is a way to provide a counter argument which can potentially de-escalate the conversation and further influence the bystanders to act against that hate speech, and also help also influence the perpetrators to change their. So I understand that the last part is very difficult in many scenarios, as we have seen in the previous session as well, that they often get more polarized or it might not work as well. But for a theoretical perspective, this is what what counter speech can do. So as this does not violate freedom of speech because we are not actually suspending the user or their post, and it is flexible. That is anyone who has certain level of knowledge and countering. So it should not. It is not necessary that you have to provide facts or provide justifications to it. You can just have some empathetical response to it. So that way it is very flexible and it is responsive. So you do not have to wait to understand if this speech should be banned or not. and you can respond with a positive tone message or something, so that at least they can know that there is an alternative view. Now, I think we are all familiar with this, that Facebook has already ensured that there is resources to counter hate speech, and they have also different avenues to for different groups to learn how to counter. But often these things have some challenges. So first is that often this onus of countering is falling to the minorities, and who are already in a more disadvantaged position in the online social media, because like more or less extremists often take over and they feel in the minority, so they do not often interact back. So that is one problem. Second, as Bertie already explained, that it is difficult to formulate a proper counter, and difficult in the sense that it is often not known by the general public that how to counter. And the third one is that speaking out again may lead to further targeting and harassment. This is another reason why people might resist to counter some hate. Now, due to this, different NGOs have come up who have just, taken the initiative to provide the initial platform to start countering. So currently, in the current social media platform, there is not much incentive to have counter speech. So these platforms actually have tried to introduce this counter speech so that we can finally move towards a more better social media platform where there is conversation rather than moderation. So me being from an NLP side, so we can always think this as a response generation problem. So in a very simple term, it is there is a hate speech giver, and you have a response generation tool, and you have to generate counter speech. While the challenges to finally generate this counter speech is very they're very nuanced, but we can at least think in this simplified manner. So recently, different transform models are available, like let's say GPU2 or T5, which can generate more or less, although maybe sometimes hallucinated, but they can generate fluent responses. So they can be used to generate counter speech. And similarly, there are newer counter speech data sets coming. So I would like to talk a bit about how this counter speech data sets are actually generated. So there is one method which we use in our paper in ICWSM. So we actually, so our paper was one of the first that had this larger data set for counter speech. So we collected hate speech. So here hate speech was more or less a video, and then we manually annotated the replies as counter and not. So here is the overall statistics of this data set. So we have counter speech and non-counter speech, and as well as divisions into different types of counter speech. So as you can see, there is one very interesting point that more or less, so we found that there are a large chunk of this counter speech are actually getting hostile, which is not a recommended strategy to counter. But there are other strategies as well, like presenting of facts and pointing out hypocrisy. So these are different strategies that the people are using. So we'll go into more details of the results later, but for overall statistics, this is the data. The other methods involve crowd-based counter speech generation. So here we are presenting the hate speech to some crowd workers, and then they try to generate the counter speech. Here again, the problem is that it may become very generic. So it can only say that don't say this word or something. Hence, it is also not a very recommended way. Then there is expert-based counter speech. Here we show the counter speech to some expert who may be some NGO operator or someone actually related to this social online harms societies. So they can actually help us generate counter speech. So this is a more principled way, I would say. So we can generate higher quality of counter speech, but again, here the main challenge is that the scale of the data set. Or as you know, this GPU2 or this new models, they require large amount of data set. So it is very difficult to scale this part. And the final one is a hybrid system where there is an author, which can be taken from tweet, or it can be a GPU to generating some hateful counter speech. And then there are some reviewers who are trying to review those counter speech based on some previously defined, well, like what is a good counter speech, what is a bad counter speech. And finally, there is an NGO operator who is overlooking all this activity. So this is one of the current ways to generate counter speech, and there are many, like one or two data sets that are coming up, which are following this strategy. But still, it begs the question that whether this generation can be fully automated. After we have this, as Bertie talked, like we have this adversarial setting also, can we ensure that the generation will be fully automated? So there are, as like, it is always very challenging to generate something counter, which as pointed out in this paper, that often this large language models has certain bias, which are often introduced during the training. So one of this bias is the Muslim and violence bias. So in this paper, the experiment was very simple. So they tried to use a Muslim in the prompt sentence and asked the GPT-3 to generate the complete sentence. They saw that more or less all the sentences has something related to violence. So these kind of nuances still exist in this model, and it is very difficult to get past them. The second point is that the strategy of counter speech also matters a lot. So we, in our paper on this iceberg paper, we saw that different groups actually try to counter in different manners. So if you see the African American community, the counter speakers call out racism and talk about consequences as shown by this graph. So you can see that they are getting the higher number of likes. So that is more or less the accepted response by this group. Few examples like I hope this cops got fired and this kind of. Whereas for the Jewish community, we observed that the people like to affiliate with the target community, that was Muslims, and the Christians to counter the hate message. Here is one example, like he is saying, Hirosha is saying that I am Jewish and I'm really glad there are some people that stand up for us, and I have no problem with this. So this is kind of affiliating with the community. So what should it do then? So there is a way that the AI systems can generate counter speech, but there are a lot of challenges in that. So what we plan ahead is to focus on building tools for this counter speakers who are actively looking, who are some NGO operators or even common users, who can use this AI systems to actually help them generate better counter speech. So to generate better counter speech, first we should know what the counter speakers actually is interested in countering. So for that, we plan to have a system which can, based on the user preference, select hate speech, which the counter speaker is actually knows about or is from the same domain. For example, I am from India. I will be more suited in countering something related to Indian demographic than some other demographic. So this can be one step in this direction, that hate speech is tuned to the counter speaker's demography or preference. The second step is counter speech generation model. Now here also we can see that generating normally will not help. So what we plan is to introduce some control parameters. So this control parameters can again take the form of politeness or detoxification or various emotions, which can actually control the generations of these models and try to create a diverse set of generations so that the counter speaker has a lot of varieties to select from. And finally, this is one of the most important part, that this counter speaking or counter speech is actually a very mentally taxing project. So moderation, the counter speaker should try to moderate whether it is hate speech or not. And then they try to generate this counter speech, which is again selecting or generating something. So it is essential to have keep track of their activities and try to reduce their stress while seeing those contents too. So this is the third part of it. So overall, our framework, the plan looks like this for us. And in conclusion, what I would like to say that we need to collect counter speech with different strategies, so that we can have a diverse data set so that this language models or this AI models can learn from. We should have counter-speech generation models which can be controlled based on some control laws, which can generate a diverse generation or generated sentences. And finally, we will focus on empowering counter speakers with appropriate tools. So I will pause here. You can find me at this address, and you can also look into our website, hatealert.github.io, to know more about this.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That was great. Both very interesting talks. Okay, so we've already got a couple of questions in the chat that I will start us off with. So this is to both of you. In the first session, we talked about the importance of the messenger as well as the message. Are there studies on how generated counterspeech is perceived if it's not masked as a human response? So I guess thinking about once we get past the point of, okay, if it is possible to create good quality targeted counterspeech that is deemed by some measurement as effective, when it is then being deployed, I know you've spoken, Punyajoy, about human in the loop approaches, which keep the kind of counter speakers as this is assistive tools. But also if we're thinking of purely generated systems which are automated, have you any thoughts on how those factors of speaker identity will impact?
Can jump in. So I have seen one study, like it was very small scale though, but I can search and maybe share the link also. So they tried to have these different identities in Twitter. So let's say identities about affiliating, about the hate speech is about blacks or African Americans, and they try to have a bot which is masked with the identity of African American. So in that cases, they saw that when the targeted group and the targeted hate speech, the communities is targeted, and that community, if it is replying and affiliating, then they found a greater effect than a normal person replying. So that there was one study that was trying to do that. So I can use the link.
Do you have any thoughts on this, Bertie?
Yeah, maybe just to add to that. I actually haven't seen a whole load of research where people have been really explicit that the counterspeech is generated by a bot. I guess generally I've seen research where people are trying to really capture human-like generation of counterspeech so that you almost can't distinguish that it's from a bot. So I think that's an interesting question as to is it still effective if people know that it's not from a human and it's been generated? I think that's really interesting. I mean, I would say that all the research we have shows that like counterspeech is obviously not just about challenging the thing that's been said, it's also about sort of communicating to other people like, look, we don't think this is okay. It's almost like an act of solidarity as much as to attack or criticize the person who's being hateful. And we know that stuff tends to be more effective when it comes from someone who seems to be invested in the discussion. So if you feel like an outsider, I think that can make it less effective, which would sort of imply that if we knew it was transparently a bot, then it would be less effective. But I haven't really seen a huge amount of research on this. Yeah,
I think that's it. Kind of intersects with the earlier conversation about social norms. Like, what role could it play in creating the norm, like, or establishing or reinforcing normative practices in that context? But is it going to have the same effect as meaningful dialogue between two people where you can have that back and forth, which potentially can work towards sort of change of opinion. So another question that we have here is to Bertie. Can we quantify how bad AI generated counterspeech currently is? Probably not very easy, since there aren't a lot of quantitative studies on human generated counterspeech either, but do you have any indicator at the moment of where that's at, or what are the particular things that it's falling down with? So for example, we know that more aggressive forms of counter speech can lead to increased incivility and exacerbate situations. So, is there a tendency towards more aggressive responses, or what kind of particularities are you finding?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the first thing is trying to see what does bad or good in this context mean. That's always the first thing to start from. And there's been quite a few sort of intrinsic metrics that have been put forward to try and assess, so for example, is the counter speech that you're generating just coherent? Does it feel like a normal sentence? And there are certain ways of assessing that intrinsically. Is it varied? Does it feel like it's a unique statement and that it's not just a boilerplate? Because obviously it'd be very easy to just have like a database of like sort of generic counter speech statements and just have a model that just randomly selects one and then pumps it out. But it is better when it feels like you're actually addressing the claim that the original person's making, and it's much more context specific. The other thing is that a lot of the work that we've been doing, admittedly like quite early stage, is to look at how can we get more human evaluation into this process, because ultimately the question is, does this feel compelling to a human? So even if we have a really good metric that says, yes, like you're improving on some technical basis, I think the proof really is in the pudding of, well, if we deploy this at scale, does this actually help us to tackle hate speech? Does it have a positive effect? But that is obviously very tricky for a range of technical, but also ethical, social reasons as well. I think.
Sorry, I was just saying, do you have anything to add on that topic at all, Punyajoy?
So I guess like few of the parts. So I agree with Bertie. Like these are very nuanced things. So it is not very easy task to evaluate something as good or bad counter speech. But I'd like to add one point that few of the things, like let's say hostility. So there is one paper by Susan Danish, so where they try to understand what is a discouraged and what is encouraged method. So there they lay out some of the, like, you should not harass or you should not say hostile things to the hate speech, which can possibly escalate the conversation further. So those things at least can be while discussing what is good or bad, those things at least can come into the picture to at least do an initial filter, and then we can properly evaluate the more nuanced factors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I guess one thing to sort of just on from there is the kind of question about evaluation and methods for annotating existing counter speech. So yeah, in terms of that process, from your own experiences, approaches are you taking, and what are the challenges? I know Bertie referenced the hierarchy of disagreement, Graham's disagreement, as one method, but there are a number of perspectives on how we do start differentiating. But once this is tried to operationalize good or effective counter speech, how is that implemented into sort of annotation schemes and evaluation schemes? And if you could speak a little bit on that, please review, that would be great. I mean, I know it's hard.
All right, I was going to say, Punyajoy, if you want to go first, you're welcome to, or I can comment on this.
So yeah, I can go first. So my experience with annotating counter speech is more or less on this line. So where we not really generated counter speech, which is a much more difficult task. So we actually added with a counter speech based on counter and not, then tried it to type. So even in that case, deciding something, I guess, like a humor statement, a humor counter speech, or a not, like what is a humor counter speech and what is not a humor. So those things of nuances still exist while detecting some type. Coming to the generation part, so this I think one of the most common strategies that, like, the largest data set that we have currently for counter speech is often like very general. So, and the other data sets which are there, which are more or less NGO experts who are trying to generate this counter speech, they are again less in numbers, but they are of high quality. So there is this trade-off between what do you want, like whether you want quality or whether do you want a large scale. So ideally, I guess once we, like, this is again following into something like a continuous process of collecting data set and then collecting hate and collecting counter-speech data set, either from online or offline. Then trying to properly evaluate them, and like I guess some form of NGO expertise will be required to evaluate whether it is good counter-speech or not. But finally, I think it should be a process of like continuous process of collection and then.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I just to add, I think the big challenge is that counter-speech is actually quite rare in the real world. And whenever you're trying to model something that's quite rare in the real world, you have this sort of difficulty of, well, I'm going to have to find some way now of identifying counter-speech. And whether that means like a really purposive sampling approach, so you do things to try and find counter-speech statements, that's going to introduce a bias into whatever you're doing, or you ask people to generate counter-speech. You say like, can you give me some synthetic examples, essentially? Like, here's some hate speech. What would you say if you saw that in the real world? And that's great when it's done by experts, like people working at NGOs who every day they are doing this day in, day out, and they really understand it. But of course, if you then get, say, like crowdsourcing approach, you've got to be very careful that they really do understand what they're trying to do and it's authentic, because the issue with anything synthetic is that it just often is not close enough to the reality that you're trying to model. So then the actual model that you build is really good at this synthetic task, not at the real task. So there's always that kind of tension. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that problem. It's just a difficulty of working in this area.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we've got a couple of raised hands. So Kathy, I think you were first. Would you like to unmute and question?
Hi, thank you both very much for this presentation. It's been really, really interesting. So my question is actually thinking about, we've talked a lot about the impact of automated counterspeech on kind of the effectiveness of the counterspeech on the audience, right? I'm curious about your thoughts on how automating counterspeech changes the impact of that experience on the counter speaker, right? So admittedly, I'm coming to this topic from a very different kind of methodological standpoint. I'm an anthropologist. My work has all been like interviewing counter speakers, right? And I'm always struck by how people talk about how empowering doing this work can be, right? Feeling afraid, doing it, then feeling like, oh my gosh, I can do this. And then people saying, and now I feel even like braver to do this offline in other communities, right? So how does that change when someone is using a pre-formulated, piece of counter speech? Do you think there's an impact, or is there a loss there? Thank you.
Interesting. Yeah, I can, Shauna, shall I respond? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is really cool because I think there's two things here. One is that we could just deploy counter speech like bots at scale, and they could just be kind of searching Twitter and Reddit and all these things just to find counter speech and then respond to it, which is one way of doing it. The other way is that you have almost like a little, like maybe something in your browser, like a plugin, which, you can highlight it. You can go like, I think this is hateful. Could you help me come up with a few ideas, because like I've been thinking about it and I'm a bit stuck, and it's almost like a prompt. And the nice thing about that is that even if we don't get perfect counter speech models, they could still be helpful for prompting someone in the real world. It might be like it's a little bit garbled and doesn't quite make sense, but it just gives you an idea of a strategy. Of course, if we set them loose as bots completely on their own, we have to really have a lot of confidence that they're going to be good and that they're not going to do something really weird and actually even motivate more hate or get people annoyed. So that's always been the way that I've seen it, really, in the idea of prompting users. But it's an interesting question as to whether it could undermine their own experience and their satisfaction. I'm not sure, and I suspect that in reality, if you did implement these tools, it would be like used some of the time, not all the time, and But yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. Punyajoy, have you seen any research on this? Because I haven't seen any, to be honest.
So I don't think I have seen exactly whether this undermines something, but I'd like to continue on Bertie's point that, yeah, this is, so whatever I am currently working on, Bertie's also, so this is not like generating the counter speech through the system on. So that will be, I guess, in a way disastrous because it does not involve it. So there should be always involvement of who are actually affected or who are actually targeted to actually evaluate the systems. So I guess that is very important. And so our research particularly is trying to do the same. So if you ask the system, like, let's say, give me some examples of counter speech which I can use. And maybe you can, from this different strategies, you can then combine the strategies or even strategies to your own and then try to produce the counter speech. So that I feel is not actually taking away from the user anything, but actually helping them to generate better counter speech.
Okay, that's great. Ray, would you like to ask your question now?
Yeah, this is just a follow up on the recent exchanges, which I found really interesting. I was just wondering whether when Bertie and Punyajoy are thinking about, how the AI can model real life human hate speech, whether there might be a bit of a trade-off between it being authentically human seeming and it being effective. And the reason I'm asking this is that it wouldn't surprise me if most of our counter speech in real life done by real humans is actually really ineffective, because we just think we've got to call something out, and that's really counterproductive because it's instantly disqualified because I'm from the opposite tribe, and so anything I say is going to be garbage. Like the studies that were mentioned earlier about how the Republicans who were made to watch the Democrat tweets were reinforced in their views. So anyway, it's just a methodological query about a possible tension between the authenticity and the effectiveness, depending on how good the real humans are. I'm Ray Langton from the philosophy faculty, by the way.
Yeah, very, very good to meet you. Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I feel like it just keeps coming back to this question of like, what are we really trying to achieve with counter speech? Because unless we're really clear on what we're trying to do, it's really hard to optimize an AI system to be good at that thing. If it's not a very well-defined task, that's always a source of problem. And it feels like there are many different things here. So we've already talked about like empowering the speaker, sort of attacking the person who was spreading the hate speech in the first place, offering support to the victim, offering support to the victim's community, which could just be anyone who views the content. And for all of these, a slightly different type of approach might be suitable. And it might also be that one approach is good at all of, can solve all these challenges. But it might be that, if what we really want to do is sort of almost educate the person who is being hateful in the first place. That's a very different type of model that we want to train than if we're trying to attack them. And I don't know, I suppose the nice thing that we can do with AI is to think about how do we optimize for the thing we'd really like people to do, rather than the thing that people actually do, which is probably like get pissed off and, and sort of almost go down to like their own ad hominem attacks. So I suppose that's another advantage of using AI, potentially, if we can get the AI to work well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so from my point of view, I guess, this is a valid point that whether these systems can actually do that. So again, this questions that whether this is effective or not actually comes up, and it's very important to say that whether this counter speech generated is actually effective. I think this is a good question, and it should actually be asked through this whole cycle of whether when you are trying to generate models or when you are trying to evaluate them. It is a important question to ask that whether this is effective or not. But from a point of NLP point of view, we are trying to have a system which can be used as a tool. So again, the onus or the important step that for now at least the steps should be taken by the experts and the NGO operators to quantify actually what is affecting the counter or what is affecting the hate speaker and what is not. And as Bertie pointed out, that there are different strategies as well to do that. So one possible option is this hope speech that is coming up to identify hope in this online world rather than hate. So those kind of things can also be pointed out, or like avoiding the users who are spreading hope but not hate. So something like those things can be introduced, but at effectiveness level, I think it will remain for a long time a task of an expert to understand what is effective and what is not.
Yeah. I'm just going to. I'm going to come to Kathy in a second. There's a quick comment on Kathy's question in the box, so I just might touch on that briefly, which is talking about the potential fear that when you're talking about the impact on the counter speakers themselves, that the speakers might tend to get biased with the auto-generated counter-speech. So in terms of if there becomes kind of an established form or format that is taken, that maybe it reduces the overall effect, because it or the diversity of counter-speech strategies will converge somewhat. Yeah, so that was a point. But on the plus side, this reduces the homogeneous effort on the part of the counter speaker when things need to be scaled up. So there's a tension, and one that has to be kind of designed into the guidelines to balance this. So that much. Kathy, would you like to come back?
I would, but I also don't want to dominate the conversation. So if anyone else has thoughts, I'm happy to step back.
You're good to go at the minute, and I've got one more I'll come to afterwards, but you go now while I.
Okay, I just have a quick, I wanted to kind of echo this question about authenticity versus effectiveness. It's something that has come up in the research that I did with the I Am Here network, that some of you may know of, this network of, collective counter-speech effort. And this question of authenticity comes up where when they're writing their counter-speech, some of the groups will often tag their counter-speech with the hashtag I Am Here for the various groups, right? And this debate about whether in some of the countries where the groups are really big and well known, that this hashtag they feel like made their counter speech less effective because it makes it seem coordinated and inauthentic, right? Because people get distracted by the hashtag and then start talking about whether this group is a problem, whether there's censors, all of these things, and it completely gets people off of this real question at hand. And it's a trade-off, because for the smaller groups, they're using the hashtag as a recruitment tool or as a tool to make other people feel safe in entering that conversation. But this question of like, how obvious is it that it's generated, I think is really interesting, right? Like if it becomes so similar that everyone knows this is the counter speech that came from a bot or came from some kind of decision tree helping you write it, then people are less affected by it because they see it as not real in some way.
Yeah, this is interesting though, because I feel like really good AI should be able to be like creative and ingenuitive and do things which in a way would almost, like, we've used generative models before to come up with stuff that we would never think of because they have like a different perspective on it, and they've seen, I mean, not that it's an actual day, but there's the data which they've been trained on is so different to the data that we would generate that they start doing unexpected things, and that's really cool because it opens new opportunities. But there is a risk that if it's not very well designed, or if you have too many filters and constraints, and this is very early research area, so it probably won't be brilliant to start off with. Yeah, it could get very, very repetitive. The one thing I wanted to add though as well is that I think the real benefit of using this at scale is that at the moment there's a lot of labor that essentially often people from communities which are already being attacked by online hate speech are having to do to challenge that speech, which kind of compounds the many unfairnesses that you see online. So if we can have a more scalable approach that helps to deal with that, there's also like another sort of social justice angle or benefit to being able to do that.
Okay. I'm going to go back. There's a question from the chat that top goal that you mentioned, Bertie, for AI was to refute the point in hate speech. But isn't a big issue with hate speech that a lot of it uses generic slurs and aggressive expressions that do not have an explicit point to them, and rather the harm in the hate speech is conveyed implicitly? And this seems like a much harder problem for AI to tackle than for people. I think it's to both of you though. Punyajoy, do you have any initial?
So yeah, I think so this is indeed a very important point. So the current, more or less, most of the research currently is based on this explicit form of hate speech, and finally the tone or what is the actual part is missing. So it is mostly based on the slurs, and then they can classify the slurs. And so recently, I think in our previous speech project as well, we are trying to focus on these groups which are not trying to only use hate or slurs, but also use other forms like fear. So fear of a target group taking over their land, or fear of a target group taking over their culture. So these things are often present in a very without using any slur words or without using expression, but in the implicitness of this tone. So identifying these kind of hate speech is again very challenging. So as you can understand, that this is a very nuanced form of, and more research is needed in this direction to actually understand what is this implicit hate and then finally. But overall, it is a very difficult problem.
Bertie, have you got any thoughts?
I mean, I think that's captures it quite well. I mean, the challenge is, I think you still can challenge the point, though. I think there's still like a claim that's being made, even if it's an implicit claim. There's and actually, Ray, some of your work I think we've used before looking at this, the kind of performative and the different dimensions of, or I think we're looking to work on perlocutionary and illocutionary acts, and like what is really being said when you start to use slurs and you start to make statements which don't have a point beyond just kind of spewing out hate, but actually they do have a point and they are making a claim, at least implicitly, and there is a relationship and a hierarchy, and that can still be challenged. But admittedly, it is a bit easier when someone literally says something that's almost pseudo-factual, and then you can actually call out the facts or call out the claim explicitly and say, no, I think you're wrong. But yeah, I think there often is to the claim that we can challenge.
But I guess it's harder for a system to be able to identify and recognize those implicit claims.
Yeah, absolutely, because you've also, in a way, you've got a two-step problem, and you've got to be able to identify what the real claim being made is, and then you've got to challenge it. And it's a bit easier if that first step is just very straightforward. You know, it's just another source of noise in your results.
Yeah. Okay, we've got another question from the chat. Do you think that machine learning and natural language processing can contribute with tools for creating visualizations of statistics, e.g. media polarization, as assistive sources for counter speakers, which they could use in a conversation? So I guess what ways might it be deployed to generate some elements that can be used to counter, but kind of accessory items rather than just generating the actual counter speech?
I'm happy to go, unless Punyajoy, if you have something you really want to say.
You can go, yes. Yeah, okay. You can.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think basically visualize. I mean, it depends exactly what you mean by the statistics, because I guess the thing is that counter speech always has to be to a specific bit of content. If you just generally counter hateful language and you say, go on Twitter and you post a message about how awful hate speech is and how we need to do more to support communities and so on. In the work that we've done, we wouldn't consider that to be counter speech, because we consider counter speech to be relational. So it's about challenging a specific bit of content in context and saying something against it. So just general positive statements, which could in another context be considered counter speech, but because they're not relational, they don't meet our definition. That's a kind of different thing. So I'm just thinking that having like high level statistics of, say, media polarization or what's going on or some of the challenges we might want counter speech to be countering, I'm not sure if that would necessarily help, but certainly you could start to build dashboards and live monitoring tools, and we've done that for hate speech before, and they are really, really useful. I just don't know if they're useful specifically for this problem, but I might have slightly misunderstood, so also feel free to clarify or correct me.
I think that was, if I hear any further, I think that was kind of the point. I don't know if you have anything that you would like to add on that, Punyajoy?
So, like, I also don't actually understand what is like this visualization, but I can suggest some of the things that. So, talking about the implicit hate speech particularly, so we can say that it often comes from very recent events, and they try to understand, like they try to say something. So, what we can actually have is some kind of sources which are actually talking about this from both the sides, let's say from left or right, in terms of particle systems or particle arguments. So that can help the counter speakers to understand the situation better, because often there is this event and there's this hate speech, and then it contextualizes. So if you can help the counter speakers understand what is this event and why is this hate, like why is this hate speech actually happening. Then I think those things can be introduced into such tools so that the counter speakers can again understand the speech better and then reply accordingly.
Okay, that's great. Okay, I've got another question here. You've both spoken a lot about the approaches to sort of natural language generation and treating it as a generation task. Is there any existing work that's taken a more information retrieval based approach? So kind of drawing, compiling, I guess, a data set of, targeted responses and pairs of, replies and approached it in that way. So measured when taking one that a response that has been used as effective counter response, and then using that in a similar context. Do you know of any work doing that, or the potential challenges that you see associated with that? I mean, I guess it's the compiling of an initial data set that covers it, but.
In terms, I can go ahead. So in terms of retrieval particularly, I think this can be important for some cases, for some very special cases of counter-speech generations. So there is one study, I guess, which tries to do something like, so they have a data set which has pre-written counter-speech. Then they try to pair them. So there is a hate speech, they pair with some counter-speech. But an inherently problem or challenge with this will be the natural part of it. So if you are retrieving, we are not actually understanding. So we can only find something closer to that context. It may not be actually the correct counter-speech. So in these cases, the counter-speech generation models can actually help. But with that, I also like to point out that the generation models can also get hallucinated. They can also generate some garbage. So there are positive and negatives of both these approaches. So
yeah.
So it depends on the complexity of what you want to achieve.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, you can go.
Okay, I was just going to add that I think that's exactly the point. Is that it basically comes down to, if you just want to generate very simplistic statements, you can just sit down with a bunch of experts and almost make templates. You can almost say well, here's 5 or 6 different types of counter speech. Here's a few different things you could change and slot in, and you could go off and make that. And that actually, I think, would be surprisingly effective. And I suspect a relatively simple, almost knowledge graph of counter speech could be really helpful. It might actually be the most simplistic tool, or sort of the easiest way of immediately helping people trying to generate counter speech. But you are then limited by the imagination and creativity of the people making the counter speech in the first place, and it will need to keep being updated. And there are certain challenges as well to how you use that. But it's probably a surprisingly effective way of doing it. It's just that most people work on this problem are more kind of AI based, and so they're gravitating towards AI solutions, even if it's not necessarily the best way of solving it.
That's interesting. Okay, so I think Stephanie, did you have a question? Yeah, because I had it.
I was almost too late, the hand. Yeah, I just have kind of a couple of thoughts, and there might not be perfect solutions or responses to this, but there's one thing that I think Bertie mentioned this as well, which I've been thinking about, is to kind of use technology to make it easier for people to come up with a counter response to something, because I get the sense that a lot of people want to be active and want to use counter speech on social media or on the internet, but they don't really know how to. And I've been thinking, if we could use something like a browser extension or something similar that could give a user a prompt of pre-formulated, or if it's just the beginning of a counter speech comment, I think that could be really useful. But I don't know too much about how actually technologically implementing that, or how well that is possible. So I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that. And the other thing is, you've mentioned that you see counter speech more as a relational response. is there anything that we can do to also, or use technology to be more proactive, to use kind of counter speech, not just in a situation where there has been like really terrible hate speech and people have been insulted, but to kind of use it more constantly to proactively or to just avoid so much hate speech being spread, if that makes sense. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
Who would like to reply to either of those, both of those points first?
Okay, I can. So regarding the first point, I guess one possible way of it could have Google extension, browser extension. Then like have some initial suggestions which can be again based on some information retrieval method. And then finally, once we have some data, we can also collect their data set as well. We can ask them to generate a counter speech and then they can reply. And finally, when we have enough data set, we can have AI suggested suggestions as well. But yeah, that is one way to actually help the counter speakers. But it also comes with a challenge, I guess. So like having this browser extension to all the users currently is a very it can be dangerous in a sense. So the counter speaker may not be well aware of that. So if I are talking about a general user, so I think we should focus first on for like NGO experts and then try to move from there and provide additional guidelines to understand what is a proper counter speech. So those things should be enclosed in such a tool. But that is and regarding the second point, so can you repeat the second point, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is kind of not very specific, I realize. Just if you have any thoughts of how technology could be helpful to be more proactive and not just reactive in the case of like hate speech or racist comments, but also kind of like maybe just remind people more often to be kind to each other and just create, I guess, a more inclusive discourse, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess there are some studies like this, and again, so this is a concept called folk speech, where they try to understand whether whether the user is trying to spread hope or not. So again, these are like kindness or kind words towards our victims. So we can have such methods which can identify these types of hopeful messages, and then maybe provide some incentive to the users. So the simple like metric to assign, like whether you have been hopeful this month or something. So those can be some incentives so that the user can actually be proactive in this part. Or not be actually hateful, but try to say their points with say the arguments, but with more kindness or like good words. So those can be again an important point in the system.
I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Bertie, but I guess yeah, to follow on, I think that's a really interesting question about how are there ways that we can improve the general quality of discussion, or support people, I guess, forms of moderation that aren't just banning or countering, but that are helping to engender better discursive practices, or interventions which might not necessarily take on the counter speech role itself, but might prompt or open up the space for other people to counter or challenge problematic contributions or move the conversation along. But we have another question here, which talks about the use of AI systems in sensitive areas, which are socially and personally sensitive. And we say that one risk is the tendencies of large-scale language models, e.g. GTP3, to hallucinate, making them hard to control. The second risk is the lack of explainability, which can create trust issues both for the user, the counter speaker, and the receiver. Bertie, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, we've been looking at this a little bit. Well, actually, maybe to give some context, we've been looking at this actually with the almost intention of making them hallucinate to see what types of toxic content are produced, which is quite interesting. I mean, this is almost, there's been a lot of work recently around what's called safety layers. So if you have a generative model like GPT-3, can you put in like a little safety layer just to make sure that in case it does go off and start producing anything which is really undesirable, and that could be hate speech, could be other things as well, all forms of biases and problems can emerge from these models. And then you kind of have this additional check. So before any of the generated text gets pushed out, you just make sure that it's okay, it's not too toxic. This is a really interesting area of research, but it kind of gets back to maybe it's the thing which you mentioned here is the lack of explainability, is that we can keep doing all this post hoc fiddling to try and correct the models, and obviously that's important. It'd be better if we could just understand fully how they work and design them so that they don't like habitually, systematically make this kind of bad content. It's another challenge to using this stuff in the real world, and it's probably also why we don't see that many like unmonitored or just completely autonomous deployments of bots to generate counterspeech.
Okay, anything more on that?
Yeah, I think that is one important part. This explanatory part is one area where we are also looking. So our specifically on native spin work tries to understand like which words actually are like, helping up, like actually are toxic in this whole spin. So this is part of detection, but the challenge doubles, I guess, for generation aspect. So we can again try to do something to understand these models. But as with this large models, you cannot really tell why this is generating something and why it is not. This is an important point. We don't have currently the answer to this lack of expertise and how to solve it. But more research is required in this solution.
Okay, so maybe one final question, if no one's going to put up a hand, or then I will just ask to just sort of to finish off on what's the biggest either technical or data focused aspect that is a challenge for you in your work at the moment that you're hoping to overcome, or that you feel is the kind of the trickiest aspect that's reliant on for a bit of to move forward and progress?
I guess Bertie will agree with me that it is always the data. So generating a good quality data and having this adversarial tunings as well is very important to understand like why this. So the adversarial setup is actually important to understand where these models are failing. So those things are actually important to like first have a good quality data and also have different types of counterspeech. Mm-hmm. So those two things I feel, so creating this whole data set will also involve annotators or moderators who can help to see whether this counterspeech is correct. So the data set creation is a very important step. And for the models, we have the language models, though they are not explainable, but they are more or less generating fluent text. So at least we can live with that for now and let the research go on to understand how this works.
I mean, 100% agree that I think the data is just a big challenge here. And again, because counterspeech just is, I mean, you know, hate speech and abusive language is a relatively recent area of research from the AI computational perspective. You know, last 10 years, it's really taken off. Counterspeech is even more recent. We just don't have enough data sets to fully understand as well what are the characteristics of a good data set, what are the things we really need to look for. So there's a lot of basic research that needs to be done. Beyond the data, I'd say for me, it's a big question of, can we get to the stage where we can start to use these models in the real world and see what works and what has a positive effect and try to measure that effectively? Now, there are some studies that have already done that, but I'd say at a relatively small scale. And ultimately, that's just the thing that I always try to bear in mind is like, what are we actually trying to achieve here? It's not just to make a nice model, it's to hopefully be able to deploy it and do something useful with it.
Yeah, and I guess thinking about there are challenges too about how best to deploy these things in safe and ethical ways, where we can test them. There's potentially, when we're dealing with volatile contexts where there is, there's scope for escalation, it requires a bit of thinking through. So yeah, well, they seem like definitely big areas to work on. Another question's just come in, so I will ask it. I'm wondering if it's possible to use the hate speech and corresponding counter speech to make some games to help users to recognize what kind of speech is hate and which counter speech is useful. When I was young, it was difficult for me to figure out which speech online is really hate, and it was more difficult for me to think of some counter speech. So there's something to help scaffold the ability to both detect and counter.
Cool. Though I would only, I mean, that sounds like a great game and something which AI can be really, really well suited to. The only thing is to be able to like give useful prompts back in the game and to almost like be able to tell people or like incentivize the right types of behavior. We would have to understand what the right types of behavior are and what counter speech does in the real world. And I'd say that we're not quite clear enough yet on exactly how it works. So there's a slight challenge, but it sounds like a cool game. Yeah.
Same here. I guess this is a very great idea, I guess, to have some games to actually teach people, I guess. So there are this like I would say workshops which are going around to teach people to generate counter speech. So these types of games can also be a part of this curriculum. So probably they will learn much easier with this types of games. But yeah, one thing is we have to first understand what is actually hate and what is actually counter, which is useful, which is not, to further develop this. Yeah. But the idea is very interesting.
And one follow-up question about the data. So I mean, that's one that would enable people to improve their own skills. But thinking about the data that is out there, there is a lack of good data sets for studying this. And obviously there's diversity across different platforms. So I'm guessing, the content you're going to find on Gab is going to be very different to Twitter. Any sort of ideas or provocations on what the next stage of building better data sets or ways to look at this? Like, I know you were kind of discussing the differences between sort of expert generated and crowdsourced, but in terms of kind of, like boosting that effort, are there spaces that we're not looking that we should be looking at, for examples, or any thoughts on how to advance the dearth of data, quality data?
One point that I can add, the current efforts that are going, they are pretty much well established in a sense, but yeah, there are some limitations as well. So one thing that can always try to find out is who is actually the counter speech, it's actually the hate speech. Try to understand their demography as well. So those metadata points can be again useful while generating. So I think that is one area where we are lacking, and it is kind of very easy to do that. So when you are collecting the data set for counter speech, you can also collect this metadata, and similarly for hate. So those things, I guess, can be easily added to the system to more intelligent choice for counter speech. That is one point.
Because it seems like the metadata is going to be, because the importance of targeted and specific approaches for different types, like having that additional data around the data is going to be quite key, and high quality annotation, I guess, is a big factor.
There's also an issue of fairness here potentially, because we find that certainly for hate speech detection, we know that models are much better at certain types of hate than others. So models tend to be better, say, at picking up on racism than, say, transphobia. And in large part, this is just because they've seen a lot more racist data than transphobic data. We don't know for sure that it's because of any unique features of that content. But of course, we run the risk that we might have really good counter-speech models for certain types of hate and abuse. Like they're very good at challenging particular types and targets and varieties and settings, and not so good in other settings, which could be a source of unfairness. If we take it seriously that these tools, counter-speech model can actually help reduce harm by tackling hate speech and can send out positive messages, then providing that we can get them to the point where they're good enough to be deployed, we also need to make sure that they're fair and they perform equally well in different settings.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think I'd like to take a minute to thank both of our speakers. That's been a really, really interesting session. So thank you both, and thank you to all people who asked questions and everyone who's been here to listen. And I think we'll wrap up this session now. The next one starts at, is it 3:45? Stephanie? Yeah, 3:45. So we'll take a short break and before we start with the next session.